So at first glance, this video is not really going to be an alternate history. But it is, because it's a classic case of why we do an alternate history. Why we would look at it as a historian. We've got this question: could seaplane tenders and their aircraft be put to greater use in the Battle of the Atlantic for better assembly coverage? Well, the thing is, they have limited assets and they're limited islands, and so the answer, broadly speaking, is no. But I'm going to spend the first half, before we get to the Shameless book plug, basically explaining that answer of why they did what they did and how they did it. But then after the Shameless book plug, I'm going to do a bit of an alternate history, which is based around the MONAB concept. Now, the MONAB concept was part of the mobile naval basing, a naval air basing sort of support force, led to things like HMS Unicorn, various other vessels being adapted to it to support a similar supporting role as her. And there was actually a concept in the 1930s, early 1930s, for having seaplane tenders and using them to set up patrol bases. Now, when I sort of started thinking this through, I was going, what does this help? What does this do? And that became an interesting thing to think through. So yes, there is going to be a bit of a classic alternate history at the for the second half, where we're going to look at what happens if you do have some vessels built up, if you do have some systems built up beyond the level which they do have available at the beginning of World War II, and what new state could be put to. Because that's the thing of, is it worthwhile? Did they make the right decision? So, the pre-war bases. These are the bases the British are operating from. Okay, around the world. Around the world. There are some interesting spots going on there. There are some really interesting spots. And some really interesting points in the world. But broadly speaking, you'll notice what there isn't a lot of. A lot of coverage of the high North Atlantic. It's mostly not British territory. But the British Empire does spread around the world. And it has trade routes going everywhere. Now, if I bring up another map, you will see there are a lot of critical trade lanes going through areas which actually there were options to secure. But one of the problems the British have is building up the necessary infrastructure in the 1920s and 30s. Building up the necessary infrastructure not just for operating aircraft, i.e. let's build an airbase, let's build all the support facilities for our airbase, especially as aircraft keep changing. In some areas, you really don't have a lot of land that's suitable for the aircraft to operate from, and then you have to supply and sustain it. In fact, in the end, if you're able to set up a seaplane tender in a harbour and operate the aircraft from the harbour, well, you can bring the supply ships directly into the harbour, and that saves a lot of trouble. It also means that you can have the ships focused, and therefore the patrol areas focused where you need them to be focused. But still, it's not necessarily going to be an easy go, is it? You have these bases to begin with. You have these trade routes and others. But these are the principal ones to protect. And let's be honest, any world war is going to make them critical. If you have a war with Japan, that's fairly easy to cut off. Okay, you can concentrate your firepower in Southeast Asia and in the South Atlantic and probably a bit in the Caribbean, and you can make sure they can't get into your global trade. That's great. Maybe an I-400 or something similarly long-ranged will be able to make it out there, but by the time it does, it's going to be one submarine on its own, and the thing is it's going to be operating at the absolute furthest of its range, and that's going to risk causing all sorts of troubles with other people, so yeah. Italy? Well, that means you cut off the Mediterranean. And Germany really isn't much of a factor for the 1920s, and even into the 1930s, it's not much of a factor. The Soviet Union, they're more of a problem, but they're so mired in internal stuff, no one really takes much notice of them. Honestly, the question you have to make yourself wonder is, how can you make the case for more of this stuff, more of this infrastructure in the 1920s and 30s? You can't. You know you're going to need the infrastructure if you'd find yourself fighting a truly world war, especially by the time you get to the mid-1930s, when you're really worrying about the rise of Germany and Italy starting rearm and Japan's looking really quite nasty, and you're going, hang on, worst case scenario, we end up all fighting all three. That's a scenario in which you're going, oh, crash build infrastructure program. Don't really have the construction crews or the aircraft to do that. That's actually part of what leads to the mobile naval basing doctrine. The Royal Navy and the wider British government's view on infrastructure and structure. It's always a classic scenario in that in the run-up to World War One, it's realised that the Royal Navy, without an Admiralty staff, has not presented its case properly for its war plans, and that's one of the reasons why the Army gets to run the games in terms of war planning. In the run-up to World War II, the poor Air Ministry completely overshoots its shot when it comes to its war planning, basically trying to decide what the Army and Navy should be doing without consulting them, and basically saying the Army's limited role is defending their air bases, and the Navy's role is to take their aircraft out there and then come back and get their carriers so they can do their operations. That kind of undermines their position with both other services and with the rest of the government, because whilst aircraft have potential, they weren't there yet. It's always a scary thing to realise, but sometimes you can say, this weapon system's going to be great. Is it great now? No. And you can't make war plans based on what's going to be great, you think is going to be great in 5-10 years' time. You have to have the war plans for today. The procurement plans are about what you think is going to be great in 5-10 years' time. But the maintenance and the force training and the planning is about what you have available now. You fight the war with what you've got, not what you want to hope and have in a decade. So there is a real problem going on here with these trade lanes and defending them. And trying to actually defend them. And trying to actually put the aircraft and the infrastructure in place to protect them. So then we have to consider the operational requirements of a seaplane tender. Now there are some limitations. Do you want to operate the aircraft actually from it, or is it basically a mobile service and accommodation space? Is its entire purpose to just lift the aircraft out of the water afterwards and maintain them? Or is it going to have a catapult system for launching the aircraft? What kind of hangar space has it got? Now, this had been the world-leading capability, HMS Ark Royal, when built Pegasus, by the time you get to World War II. And she operates Supermarine Walruses. She is one of the 2 seaplane carriers at the disposal of the British Empire and the British, I would say the Royal Navies in World War II. And she's used. She's doing patrol operations from Africa and all sorts of other places around the world. She's a useful asset. She's a mobile base. But there's only one of her. And she doesn't carry that bigger aircraft because, let's be honest, as there were only one of them, they didn't really put that much money into really developing aircraft which were orientated around them rather than, let's say, fleet reconnaissance capabilities. It's kind of like if the US Navy had developed the PBY Catalina and instead focused on the Kingfisher. It's not a bad aircraft, in fact it's a very good aircraft in many ways, but it's not the same capability. And that's ultimately your problem when you start looking at this is, okay, well the big problem is you have a limited number of assets, a very limited number of assets, and they have a limited capability because the aircraft they have available to them, so they really can't do much more than they did historically. And it gets worse once you start looking at the options. The Azores, well that's owned by Portugal. Bermuda is Britain, that's this one over here. And of course Canada and Newfoundland, this is all British Empire, so you can operate from there. But Greenland, Denmark, and Iceland is Denmark. And those are occupied quite quickly at the beginning of the wars because of the fear of the Germans occupying them after Norway. But the thing is, you haven't exactly got spaces for the ships to operate from. Because the seaplane tender doesn't operate vessels from the sea like an aircraft carrier. It can, in theory, launch and recover whilst underway, but in practice it's very difficult, very damaging, very risky for the aircraft, and usually what you're talking about more is that the ship turns up to a bay, turns up to a harbour, turns up to an area, sticks itself in that area, maybe sets up some sort of defences as well in the area, as well as having its own defences, and parks itself and operates the aircraft from there. Consider it more of a mobile base than a ship. There aren't many spaces to operate. So realistically, the answer I should give you is quite a simple one. There's not really anything they can do. There's a reason why you have to go for the escort carrier solution to the problem. There's a reason why you have to try and get long-range aircraft based from those places. But there are problems even with that, because you see, basing long-range aircraft, if you already had something like the PPY Catalina equivalent already in naval service and the tenders for it to support it, becomes a different criteria. You see, one of the reasons why you end up with this kind of vessel, HMS Unicorn in this case, being built is because of the British trying to get around their infrastructure problems. And the MONAB, as said, has ideas. And if you had a policy going forward of having those facilities, those vessels, then you could probably have rolled up to those places, especially once you got the alliance agreement with the Portuguese sorted out, and once you got the sort of the various things in terms of Denmark, occupation of Denmark area, Faroes, etc., and Iceland and Greenland and all those places. Well, if you've got seaplane tenders of a viable capability and seaplanes of a viable capability, Short Sunderland is actually a bit big for this scenario, but it could be a good example. They could certainly have a very critical role as being the sort of infrastructure that supports the seaplane tenders by being able to fly to them and drop off cargo and then fly back when they need spare parts, etc., to help sustain the operations. But you probably want something more like a Catalina, but we'll get into that later. You could quickly set up operations. You would have those operations almost immediately. Because how long does it take for the ship to disembark and get ready to operate versus how long does it take to survey the land, decide where is best, sort out the acquisition of the land that's required for putting in an airfield, put in the necessary infrastructure to support it, the fuel and the mechanics and the hangars and all the other stuff, and then operate the aircraft from it. Well, even the best estimates of that's going to take months, 2 to 3 at least, to do all that work. And if you want to do it without causing problems in the area you've acquired control of, probably longer, because you're going to need to get buy-in from the locals, which is just going to add more time. So that's why there's a sort of delay in terms of we have this space, why aren't we operating aircraft from there yet? Well, because it takes time. And the quicker you can have aircraft operating from there, the better. Now, the thing is, if we take this idea as our base point, and we take the work done, which goes into Unicorn, which goes into the concept of the mobile naval basing, the concept of the infrastructure to support the Royal Navy operating in the Far East. Yeah, the Royal Navy's built up this doctrine with the idea of fighting in the war over here to sustain themselves on the other side of the world from their major industrial base, Britain. They had to work out all sorts of infrastructure to get around. This is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is kind of weird, because people go, well, they haven't invested in a lot of fast fleet oilers. Well, they were actually investing in some of them, but the trouble is, Winston Churchill has a bright idea, and some of them get converted into amphibious ships at the beginning of World War II because you don't need fast fleet oilers for the Mediterranean and the North Sea, but you do need amphibious ships. You do actually need some fast oilers for North Atlantic. We'll leave that to one side though. And Winston, God bless his soul, it took him a while to realise he wasn't really fighting World War One. He was fighting World War Two, but ultimately, there are a lot worse options, and trust me, there are a lot worse options than him being the leader at the time. But leaving that to one side, one of the things they could go for is literally having this Unicorn, which is pretty much, okay, it's a forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. Forward aviation support ship. Never forget. But what it is about, what it is for, what it is useful as. Imagine if you'd taken that idea as well as doing this, you'd also produced a seaplane tender version of it for setting up seaplane reconnaissance, because you had that capability. Now, the other trouble you have for the Royal Navy with this is that the Fleet Air Arm at this point in this when I'm talking about this is under control, is split. Okay? So operationally, the Fleet Air Arm is part of the Royal Navy. In terms of paying for it, it's part of the Navy. In terms of its observers, it's part of the Royal Navy. In terms of its fitters, i.e. its mechanics and maintainers, and its pilots, it's split. And there's a nice dual ranking system going on. And some of those personnel are entirely RAF. And the trouble is, its procurement is done through the Air Ministry. So the Royal Navy asks the Royal Air Ministry, says they want this is what they ask the Air Ministry what's possible, then tells the Air Ministry what they'd like. The Air Ministry then goes and tells industry, and it's a whole wonderful circuit. The problem is with all this is trying to change something for that, but it's not actually as impossible as it makes out, because again, the Royal Navy gets the Supermarine Walrus, and they also have a habit, which is nicely shown off by this picture, of getting even their Swordfish with float planes. Pretty much everything's got a float plane. Why? Because the Royal Navy believes in having their aircraft being multi-purpose. Not just a torpedo spotter reconnaissance, but able to be both a ship plane and a land plane in configuration, or a float plane and land plane in configuration. That's useful. And then we add in good old Article 8 of the London Naval Treaty. I do love this article. It comes in so handy so often, because you see, you've got naval service combatant vessels exceeding 600 tons but not exceeding 2,000 tons. That's Section B. That's the sloop section, as I often describe it. But then there's Section C. That's even more exciting. Section C. Naval service vessels not specifically built as fighting ships, which are employed on fleet duties or as troop transports, or in some other way than as fighting ships, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun above 6.1 inch caliber, mount more than 4 guns above 3 inch 76mm caliber, are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots, are protected by armor plate, are designed or fitted to launch mines, are fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. Okay, Section C is good. These vessels are exempt from limitation. Now, there's also Section D and Section E. Mount more than 1 aircraft launching apparatus on the centerline, or 2, 1 on each broadside. If fitted with means of launching aircraft into the air, are designed or adapted to operate at sea more than 3 aircraft. Operate at sea more than 3 aircraft. Are you starting to see the get-out clauses? And there's even a special note in the annex, part 4, section 4, about HMS Ark Royal, aka Pegasus, or rather HMS Pegasus as it was now, and her being kept in service as an experimental ship. So the thing is, you can build these as big as you want. You can build tenders. They can't be armed with more than 4 guns above 3 inches. That's terrible. I mean, that's going to limit me so massively. No limitations on speed, though, this time. That's useful. They're not supposed to operate more than 3 aircraft at sea. Well, it could have the hangar space of 3 aircraft. I could always fly out any more aircraft I wanted to operate on there. Or I could always box the aircraft, or they're just stored on deck. It's got hangar space for only 3 aircraft. It only operates 3 aircraft. The fact that I store another 12 to 15 on deck is neither here nor there. That's just what I do when it's in transport configuration. And it doesn't operate them at sea. It operates them from a harbour or a bay. This is honestly why the Royal Navy was looking at it. It's also, honestly, some of the hoops which Unicorn jumps through to make her not an aircraft carrier, a forward aviation support ship, so she doesn't come from the carrier tonnage. She doesn't come from the carrier tonnage. It's also why she's fitted with the gun shears and all those things. Admittedly, though, you also have the Second London Naval Treaty and various other codicils beyond that, but this is stuff from the First London Naval Treaty. Gives us some time to actually do something. So the thing is, they had the opportunity, they had the reason, defence of trade. The thing is, they couldn't persuade the government, as I talked about, and this is why you don't have these facilities available in World War II. They couldn't persuade the government because the government was going, but why would we need that? Why would we need that? And you can, to an extent, understand it. But also, the fact is, the US Navy managed to do it. Now, admittedly, they have an advantage. They have complete control of their air service, including the reconnaissance section, aka what the Royal Navy would refer to as Coastal Command, which was the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command. The USN had complete control, so they could justify building ships like this, the Barnegat class. 2,040 tons. Pretty much no aircraft storage aboard, but it's got enough space to do maintenance and lift them out the water if it needs to do maintenance and look after them. But it's a seaplane tender. Couple of 5-inch guns forward. Decent sized hull. Decent sized vessel. Really not that complicated. Again, for the Royal Navy, it's not that complicated. The limitation, as always, is the Treasury. It is what funding you have and what you're going to allocate it to. And if you don't have control of the aircraft you need to fly from this, or if you're going to expand the Walrus units, well, you can do that. But there are limitations. There are limitations. Now, whilst seaplane carriers, seaplane tenders would have been useful, they would really have been useful in the Battle Atlantic in terms of setting up the initial phase. Once you're able to get the airfields going on land, you really have no need for them. There's no real justification for them. Admittedly, though, they can provide so much interplay between the two in terms of operations and capability. It would probably still keep them around, because especially if you had developed long-range float seaplanes to use for those operations and utilize those facilities, if you had the seaplane tender sitting offshore and you built a seaplane base onshore, Well, then, between the two, that's the best of both worlds of facilities to sustain the aircraft. You've got the thing onshore if it can get ashore, and if it can't get ashore, you've got something offshore which can do the full lift you out the water, let's fix you such a scenario. But you need the actual ships and you need the aircraft to do it. And that's ultimately the problem. They don't have the ships, they don't have the aircraft, they don't have the things they need to do it. Why? Because it's really hard to justify the facilities you need to defend global trade when, on paper, you can block off your likely enemies from that global trade with minimal effort. Because the trouble is the judgments, the procurements, the analysis of the national leaders is based on those piece of paper, based on those maps. And to them, it's an easy situation. And this is usually the point where people like me, who talk about these sort of things in terms of risk management, in terms of conflict deterrence, will start talking about, well, what's the level of risk you want to tolerate? Because whilst it's a very small chance, theoretically, if we're at war with Japan, they get into the global sea lanes, or a very small chance, if we're at Italy, they get into global sea trains, and there's a chance we end up at war with both of them. If they do get into the global sea lanes and trade, what damage are they going to do? What is the potential damage they're going to do? Because you see, ships don't just get rerouted because the ones that, it's not just affected are the ships that are sunk. There's also the ships which are rerouted, the cargoes which are rerouted, the cargoes which don't sail on time. All the opportunity lost, all the economic knock-on effects and consequences. All the diplomatic issues of the war rippling out. And you having no answer to it. Having nothing there. No response. Now, sometimes that you get an audience which is listening to that and goes, so what you're saying is you're buying insurance. Yeah, you're buying instead of buying a policy which will fund you out if this happens, you as a government are buying a certain level of capability, which you know is for secondary and tertiary theatres, not for a primary theatre. You know it's for secondary and tertiary theatres. But by having that capability, you are freeing up units to go elsewhere. You're stopping yourself have to suddenly adapt to circumstance. You don't have to go, oh, frigate, the enemy have got behind us. Pull back destroyers, pull back cruisers pull back a carrier from the fleet operations to go and hunt these submarines down. You don't have to do that. You go, well, the seaplane defenders are already deployed. The seaplanes are already hunting out. We've got the old cruisers out in there, and we've got some old destroyers. Yeah, give them their go. They're already set up. They're already receiving them. And you have to choose. Sometimes your audience will listen to that and think, that's a good idea. And sometimes they'll look at it and go, but that's going to cost money we can use for other things. The conversation I once had, and this was not that long ago, about hospital ships, was actually between building a hospital ship that can respond to natural disasters in the UK and abroad, as well as support operations globally and all the things we need a hospital ship for, and building a hospital in the UK itself. And the honest argument that was made back to me was, well, it's an either or. And I found that very strange, because those two things do a very different role. One is about soft power, diplomatic power, and it's a good way of spending, in my view, money you normally contribute to foreign aid and help the world, which to an extent as the British Empire, because of our connections, because those countries have been were part of what made Britain the position it is in the world, but also helped it in 2 world wars, provided people, provided blood, money, and treasure to those 2 world wars on our side. We owe a debt to them when they are when they are in need, when they have a crisis. We should respond. They responded when we had a crisis. We should return the favour. That is an understandable thing to me. And one's about looking after your own domestic population in the way the UK works. Those are not mutually exclusive things. And we're also, when you start looking at the budgets and things for involved, etc., it's not that much money. And also, guess what? A hospital ship can also be used to support in the UK. If you have a natural disaster in the UK, if you have an issue where a hospital suffers a major power cut, or there's a major issue, and you haven't, or something like the COVID crisis, well, a hospital ship becomes quite handy then. It becomes a facility you can use, something you can mobilise for your own national use. That's useful. Those arguments didn't succeed, though. To be fair, though, and Lord bless them, they not only didn't do the hospital ship, they also cancelled the hospital they were going to build as well. You know, saving money, that's the best national interest. Always. Anyway, shameless book plug. So, shameless book plug, and why do I put these in the middle of my videos? Well, because A, it's an opportunity for me to say thank you to all of you for supporting the channel, helping it grow. Liking, sharing, subscribing really does help the channel grow. B, it's kind of useful as a marker today, and with this new style of videos as we go forward. We do have these videos come up. And C, it allows me to advertise books, and as a naval historian and academic, my worth is entirely judged on how many books I sell. That's it, basically. You have no other metric. How much money you earn, doesn't matter. Your title, that's entirely based on how many books you sell. Car you drive, entirely based on how many books you sell. Which, considering the money you get back from books, it's quite disturbing. But leave that to one side. This has been the format for several hundred years for how academics were judged, how well their books do. It's not going to change now. The changing prices, the changing situation. It's going to take years for the culture to catch up with the situation. But that doesn't worry me. What worries me is I enjoy teaching. I enjoy talking to students. I enjoy having a reason to leave these 4 walls. Or, well, actually not 4 walls, let's be honest. When I say 4 walls, I am underestimating on this room, because it's got the one there, the one there, the one there, that's 3. That one, I suppose, is 4. Then 5, 6, 7. Potentially 8, depending on how you analyse it. Walls of this room. There's a really interesting corner. Let's just leave that inside. But it's nice to go and teach students. It's nice to go and have the face-to-face interaction. And, yeah, all of that is thanks to you buying books. So I always advertise my book. There's always a link down below, both to an Amazon store which has books I recommend by other authors as well as my own. And there's a link down to my book as well. There are soon going to be hopefully joined by more books. The process of that's progressing quite well. I'm hoping it's going to be a late birthday present to myself in March. But because I'd like another book out. If I could, I'd get 2 to 3 of the 45,000 word books published this year, if I can get the money for the pictures. It's the right to do the pictures. And what I love is the first book to come, the book about the Flower class corvettes is basically photos I took of HMCS Sackville. Photos from the wonderful Drac and his set of photos of Flower class corvettes. And there's a couple of photos I want from the Imperial War Museum, because they really do make the book fit together nicely, including one of Admiral Henderson. And it's those books which have held it up, those pictures which have held it up. So it is my own fault. It is my own stupidity, but, you know, I want those pictures. Because I want the book to be good when I want it to be as good as it can be when I put it out. Because, let's be honest, books... The other thing for academics, especially if you pretty much don't have a social life, which is a fun thing. I have moving house. I don't... Anyone who's gone through moving house will know exactly what I mean. I don't have a social life. I have moving house. The book kind of has a lot of pressure on it. So I want it to do well, and I want it to be as best as it can be. I don't want to use the Sheldon Cooper phrase of "it's my mind, baby," but because that's a bit weird. But you know, that's it. Anyway, let's go back to the beginning. Because if we do look at this as a whole world problem for the Royal Navy, and we do consider once again those trade routes from that earlier picture, that earlier slide. We go back all the way back to here. Those trade routes. And we do think about, well, in the case of a war with Italy, yes, they've got forces in East Africa, they could have submarines deployed. You're going to have a lot of trade start going round around Africa rather than through the Mediterranean. That's going to be a huge amount of trade. How are you going to protect that? And you're going to need to protect that, because that's going to be something which they're going to try and probably target. You know, they could try all sorts of things as commerce raiders. Okay, so I've got to protect that, and well, what about the trade going down to South America as well, and the stuff through Asia? If you're dealing with the Japanese, again, you've got to establish something in the Falkland Islands. You've got to establish something in all sorts of facilities around the world. And let's be honest, the facilities in the Falklands are not great. They're really not. Are there, you use them, but they're not great. And you've got other options around the world. You could use them. You could use. So this is the scenario here. Let's say those conversations in the 1930s, instead of being stopped by, they're not going to break into it. They're not going to do it. It'll be managed. They'll be kept. Someone went, okay. What do you need as a backstop? Now that's an interesting question, because what do you need as a backstop? Hundreds of seaplane carriers? A dozen? Half a dozen? 2 dozen? What do you need? And let's think about this from an effect on the wider war if you do have them deployed in World War II. There are a lot of operations which go on around the world which cause trouble. A lot of surface raiders out there. A lot of things which are very difficult to track down at certain points. You don't have satellite reconnaissance. You have to have aircraft going and doing the surveillance if you're going to do wide air patrols, or the ships. Well, if you can set up seaplane tenders at key points around the world, then it doesn't matter if you don't have the airfields. Doesn't matter if you don't have the infrastructure there yet. Any infrastructure you build ashore, you can build, but you've got time bought for you because, well, you've got the seaplane tenders there. And that's a useful thing. It is. There are some problems, though. There are problems with this. The number one problem is going to be the aircraft. You've got a choice of the Fairey, Swordfish, or the Supermarine Walrus, realistically. I would love to say you'd be able to get something else. And I did look into this quite seriously, and there is actually a third option. There is a third option. The third option is buying the consolidated PBY. That's an amazing aircraft for long-range reconnaissance and presence, an amazing aircraft for maritime security, especially dealing with surface areas, but also dealing with the submarine threat. It means if a submarine's on the surface, it's spotted and goes, oh, hello. Now, the thing is, realistically, you're going to start off, if you're starting off early in 1930s, you're going to be designing ships around the Walrus and the Swordfish. That is what you're going to be designing around because that's what you have access to. The British are not going to buy immediately. But 1938, 1939, things could be different. Now, you could, of course, do your own development. You could also try and get a licensed version of the Catalina to build in the UK. There are options. Either way you go, whether you stick with the British aircraft which are available to the Fleet Air Arm, the Walrus and the Swordfish as options, they have a few hundred miles range, so yes, it's not as fantastic as the PBYs, but it's not a bad range either. It's still a useful asset. It's still, if you sit one at South Africa, Cape Town, Durban, Williamstown, or anywhere else sort of in that area, you're still going to have a useful asset. You're still going to be able to create a useful channel of safe water where your merchant ships can push through without much worry about surface raiders. They're still going to have to worry probably about submarines as the war goes on, but especially at the beginning of the war, they're going to have to worry less about surface raiders because there's going to be something always up there keeping an eye on things. And so for surface raiders, here's the thing. Do you operate in those areas? People think, oh, they have to kill us. No. The surface raider knows there are going to be aircraft. They'll be making noise, radio chatter, etc. The surface raider will hear that. And the question for the surface raider is it worth the risk? Because if the surface raider gets damaged or gets made by aircraft, then there's going to be cruisers hunting them down. There's going to be other things brought into the area. It's far easier to go where they're not. Now, that's the advantage, of course, when you have the PBY Catalina. There's a far less area you're not. But bear with me. The thing is, when you have the tenders in service, the aircraft they support can be different than the aircraft they carry. They could carry a squadron of... Well, what you could do is you could have them fly out with a couple of squadrons of Walrus in terms on board. They could carry, have the aircraft they can store actually in their hangar space. They could have the ones they can store on the flight deck. That's great. And a pair of them set up an operating ASINs facility between them. Great. They're operating, they're supporting, and you could get a squadron of PBYs out to them. You could fly a squadron out to them. And they could have all the stores and everything on board anyway, to begin with. So you just have to fly the aircraft out. And suddenly you've got 2 squadrons of Walrus and a squadron of PBYs operating from an area. In which case, the area around the port for up to 600 nautical miles is very heavily patrolled, and the area beyond that is well patrolled. And suddenly that starts to have an impact on things. That starts to affect your operations of your fleet and your management of surface raiders. It also starts to, if you do this early enough on in the war, if you've got this from the beginning of the war at get-go, that starts to have an attrition effect on everyone. Especially the Axis forces. You see, wars, especially long wars, are about attrition. They're about cumulative impact. Now, the other thing is, if you have these vessels as the core of your ASW force, etc., and providing that capability, is you also might be less inclined to use carriers for that role. At the beginning of the war, you might save them from other duties instead of them doing the fleet carrier role, providing anti-submarine warfare the core for ASW hunting groups. Well, we've got the patrol aircraft from our tenders. We can set them up. We can operate them. They can be providing with support. Now you might still do it. You might still lose things like courageous in this scenario, but you might not because they might not be used that way. You've also had a growth in the fleet air arm strength to support this. You've had a growth in the strength of the fleet air arm in numbers of aircraft, which potentially has accelerated things like the Inskip Award. You've had a growth in the number of aviation personnel, in the number of fitters and etc. who are from naval service. All these things will have put you on a better footing for wartime, and this does fit with the mobile naval basing. The Royal Navy has all sorts of forces, including a defence force made of Royal Marines and other things who are supposed to go and defend the bases they acquire. So in many ways, not having these vessels was more strange than actually having them, because it's a missing piece which fits in with the structure. Because if you designed your seaplane tender correctly, they could also be, oh, they're not just the seaplane tender when they turn up, they're also act as the harbour control ship. In fact, you could have, the reason they could operate in pairs is one could use its staff spaces for being the harbour control ship and having the radios and facilities for coordinating the harbour and and the other one uses radio and facilities for coordinating the aircraft. It makes sense. It actually fits with Royal Navy doctrine. This is the scary thing for me. This is why I was interested in doing this as adding the alternate history bit on, because once you start talking about resources and allocation of resources and, world wars being marathons, not sprints, and all these things, those are phrases which roll off the tongue, but they really are true. Classic example is the Graf Spee. In the beginning of World War II, what causes Britain the most economic issues with its global trade? Is it German submarines? No. It's the Graf Spee. By far and away, the biggest problem is the Graf Spee. You think about it. There is tension coming. There is tension in the world. The Royal Navy might deploy some of these tenders around. They might deploy it. If they have it by that point already, they might well deploy the Catalinas around, if they have them. I'm never quite sure in this scenario whether they would be a wartime acquisition made in 1939 or if they would actually be ordered in 1938. There is part of me which is seriously tempted to say they'd be ordered in 1938, because if the Royal Navy's got to the point it's managed to grow the forces. The reason I say 1938 is the Inskip War historically happens in 1937. You've had these. If you have this if you have this growth happening, you possibly move the Inskip Award earlier to 36 because of the size of the forces are that much greater. And that then gives the Royal Navy slightly more time and control. And realistically, in 1937 onwards, there's this fight going over British domestic aviation industry and who has what. So for the Royal Navy going outside to America and ordering the Catalina, they could probably get away with that in the time of 1938. And if you consider the Americans have that already on the production line, they have a production line going, that's actually kind of easy to order off. I'm fairly sure Consolidated would be very happy to hear they had an extra customer and would expand operations significantly to support them. And the thing is, the Canadians purchased them. Eventually, the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force operate them. So, the Royal Navy operating them in this period is not, again, that far out of the scenario. It's not a massive problem. So, you have these aircraft coming in. You have these capabilities. Something like the Graf Spee wandering around is going to go, where should I go to? You see, the thing is, if you have the aircraft operating from those Freetown, Sierra Leone, from the various positions in Africa, that suddenly makes all those areas where historically the Graf Spee operated a lot more dangerous. A lot more dangerous. Because the thing is, if it gets spotted, it comes close already to a full HMS Cumberland comes very close to her. They manage to miss each other, but you have enough aviation assets, she could get spotted. She gets spotted earlier, or she's avoiding them. And by very nature, by avoiding those aviation assets, that narrows down the areas she can be, which means it's far more easy for you to have resources allocated to those areas. Okay, so we know she's not in this area, this area, this area where we have aircraft operating, so she must be heading here. The River Plate could still be, it would still probably be a weak spot, because would Uruguay, would Argentina, would any of those countries allow you to base some of these ships out of there? No. No, they wouldn't. But the thing is, because it's one of the places you can't base those as seaplane carriers, and you can't have the aircraft there, you can make some cruisers already waiting there. So maybe the Battle of River Plate happens earlier. It's similar with the Indian Ocean. The Grouse Bay famously breaks into the Indian Ocean, goes out there and causes trouble, and then doesn't quite reach the area which is being patrolled by tribal-class destroyers. Doesn't quite. If it had been gone north a little bit longer, the odds are it runs into a full flotilla of tribal-class destroyers. Now, do I think the tribals win that battle without losses? No. Do I think the Graf Spee, though, faced with 8 destroyers gunning for it hard, 8 tribal-class destroyers gunning for it hard, that it's going to have a nice time and get away? Probably not. Yes, it's got 11-inch guns, but honestly, the destroyers are not going to be hanging out at ranges at which the 11-inch guns are comfortable engaging. They're not going to engage in an artillery duel. They're going to be diving close and as hard, as fast as they can to get into torpedo range and slam some torpedoes into her. So, the thing is, these assets might not kill her themselves. I'm not making that claim. They might do damage, they might not. Doesn't really matter. But avoiding the adjustment in operation patterns because of them is going to both make it easier for the British forces to work out where she probably is, but it's also going to make it more likely she ends up going into contact with them. Because I don't think she would go into the Indian Ocean in the first place, because of the likely operation of aircraft and their facilities in that area. Because again, if you build the seaplane tenders, it's not like building the actual infrastructure in terms of the air bases. Building the air bases is a major commitment to those areas, and you would require many more air bases. Whereas if you build, let's say, 24 seaplane tenders that you're going to operate, you can move them around. That's the thing. You're not committed to any one course of action. You're not committed to any one course of operations. You can move them where you need them. I was looking at it going, well, surely it would be cheaper to build the air bases, but then I was working out the air bases, and you're basically, they end up building during World War II, and you're in the low hundreds of air bases. And yes, that's what you realistically need to cover the area. Don't get me wrong, you can't do complete coverage with these seaplane ships. You cannot. But the thing is, they're going to be partial coverage, and enough coverage that the Royal Navy could get them. Despite probably arguing against the Air Ministry and arguing against the other services, if the government decides to fund it, getting a couple of dozen would not be problematic. They would fit within the treaty limits, and they would add on to the basing system. Because you could also say, well, they're going to be setting up the harbour infrastructure as well, which the vessels like Unicorn come into to pick up their supplies and then go out. So this seaplane tender also sets up, as well as supporting the seaplanes ashore, sets up the infrastructure base ashore that we need to interface with for the Unicorn coming in. There are all sorts of options of how you can play this and how it can work as part of an integrated, basically mobile infrastructure system you're setting up. And the interesting thing is, when you start reading the papers, that was the case they were making. I have that lovely document in terms of the naval trade that I showed earlier. I have all my Admiralty documents, all my archive documents, picture files stored on computers. So I spent a fair amount of time going back through those files about Unicorn, and it was really interesting reading them with this in mind. and thinking, honestly, this is the case they're making, so this is probably how they would implement it. Can I tell you how it goes after about 1930 and 1940, 41? Not really. But I can tell you how it sort of will build in 1939, 1940, because it's going to be a cumulative thing. If the Graf Spee is less successful, that's going to be a problem. We already know Hitler has a tendency to be very, very sensitive when it comes to his large capital ships. If she hasn't had the successes she had, and she gets lost more quickly, even worse, if the Deutschland gets found because of the greater number of patrol aircraft, let's say she gets spotted by some of the by some vessels, aircraft operating out of Newfoundland or something like that. Ooh, that's going to be a problem. That's going to cause issues, and that's going to have ripples. The greatest ripple that would happen in World War II is if the Royal Navy managed to sink the Deutschland in 1939 while it's out on patrol. Because the Royal Navy sinks, or worse still, captures Germany, would just be devastating, morale-wise. Would it win the war for Britain? No. Would it cause Hitler to have an absolute brain fart? Probably. I mean, I honestly wonder whether Bismarck and Tirpitz would actually get completed in that scenario. But we'll leave that to another time and another discussion. So let's consider losses in the early months of the war. Now, despite this coming from a British document, I do want to point out this comes from a British document, which was supposed to be released on the 20th of November, 1944. The copies I can find for it are the American Office of War Information copies. Now, this doesn't surprise me because a lot of the interim data tables at the end of war are basically, they're just folded. Britain has got the end of war data tables which have all the information on, and so a lot of the archives don't retain the interim ones. But because of the way the Office of War Information worked, because of the way the American system works in terms of their preservation of documents, they have survived. And this one, you can actually find an actual example of it, or rather, you can find it to go and check the data yourself on the American Merchant Marine at War, the USSMM.org page, and they've got right at the front Allied merchant ship losses 1939-1943, and I basically found that particular website by doing a reverse data search to try and see if there was anywhere I could recommend for people to go and look at it and find it. I went, let's type in this data and see what pops up. Oh, that popped up. Okay. And as you can see, there's a lot of ships lost. There's also a lot more journeys lost. There's a lot more opportunity cost. There's a lot more consumption of materials and resources avoiding. And when we consider this is the point at which the submarines really start getting to work. This is when the submarines really start getting to work. This point they're building up. They're getting in there, but this is when they really have their heyday. 1941, 1942. In scenario, they're building up at this point, over this point. And a lot of these losses are from surface raiders. So again, remember war is cumulative. Remember that point, war is cumulative. Early losses versus early wins can have a big impact down the line. You lose less at the beginning, you have more to fight in the middle, and you therefore probably lose less in the middle, because you can bring more overwhelming force. And you lose better, you win better at the end. That's the aim. So it's cumulative. And also, if you take out more of the enemy resources earlier in the war, when they're at the weaker point, when they're still building up their forces, when they're still building up their experienced personnel, when they're still scaling themselves up, that can have a big impact, especially on the psychology of their commanders and what their war aims are, what they think is a viable operation. You see, one interesting thing is if you have these patrols set up, if you have these presences, did the Germans and the Japanese ever consider the idea of trying to run submarines between each other? Because if there are all these patrol presences, around the Empire, around the shipping lanes, that's going to complicate things massively. It is going to complicate things massively. It's complicated enough as it was. But if they've had losses to those aircraft, if they've had ships found by those aircraft in the early war years, what kind of fear is that going to build into them? What kind of factor is that going to have on them in terms of their operational capability? Are they going to think it's a viable option for them? So you see, these things build up. These things have a cumulative impact. Also, what impact does losing less ships have on, and less merchant ships have on the Royal Navy, have on the Allied war effort? Have on the decisions you make as a government, on what is viable, on what is necessary, on what is suitable. I don't think seaplane tenders would save all these ships. Please don't put those words in my mouth. But I do believe they would make surface raiders a lot easier to deal with. They would make the submarine attacks on the trade going up the African coast a lot more difficult. And they would have a wider impact beyond that, because, again, the Mediterranean is an island war. The Mediterranean is an island war. If you've put this effort into building these things as part of the mobile naval basing force, etc., and structure, then you would probably have already got operations of aircraft going from Crete and other things in the Mediterranean, which will have an effect on operations. It will do. If you've got these facilities to go on, it's actually easier to set up the fighter bases ashore and things like that if you've got the facilities there. Because if you go, well, there's a ship turn up which has all the machine shops and all the facilities there with it. It can carry all the infrastructure. It's got all the spare parts, etc. All we have to do is get them off the ship. These ships already exist. Suddenly, that makes setting up the facilities, setting up the capabilities a lot easier. You're not manufacturing these things from scratch. You're not trying to develop them. You've already got them developed in service. And that can have an impact. But there's also the Far Eastern deterrence. Again, let's say you still lose carriers. You still lose courageous. You still lose glorious. Although, I would argue in this scenario, I think if you don't lose courageous, it's doubtful you lose glorious. But we'll leave that to one side. And as I said, there is part of me which thinks that the odds are, for especially the areas they're operating in, if they've got increased ASW forces from these aircraft, from seaplanes and seaplane tenders, they might well deploy those to support that area because of where they're operating, than necessarily deploy 2 fleet carriers, Ark Royal and Courageous. They might just deploy 1 fleet carrier, in which case it's going to probably have, well, potentially should have the escorts which would be assigned to the other fleet carrier for that role. And so that could change things. It might not. Literally, once you start adding in this, you are changing a lot of the World War II's operations. But it's worthwhile considering it. Because again, it comes back to, what do we lose out by not doing this? What do we gain by not doing this? What do we lose by not doing this? The gain, arguably, probably is that you get HMS Unicorn. There is an argument that if you've got these constructions, do you not get Unicorn? I think you would still do so with Henderson and the personalities you have there. And the way they managed to push her through, I think it's still likely. But the thing is, this money's going to have to come from somewhere. That discussion I talked about earlier of the hospital versus the hospital ship, which do you invest in? And it ended up being they invested in neither. Well, what do you put where does the money come from this? They're not going to be expensive. They're not going to be that difficult to make. They're probably going to be merchant hulls in sort of some scenario. More merchant build hulls. Well, where does the money come from? Ultimately, you need to find some from somewhere. I'm not sure what part of the naval budget I would not want to see spent to invest in this. There isn't really anything. But there again, even the Navy at the time, from about 1937 onwards, and even arguably slightly before that, is often argued to be underspending what the Treasury was prepared to spend on it. It's just that this was not something the Treasury were prepared to spend on because they couldn't see the justification. So if you made the Treasury see the justification of it, see the trade protection value of it, then you get them. And then for the Far East, well, again, they're not going to be fighters. They're not fighters, but they're going to give you reconnaissance assets. And if you can deploy them, if you can put them into the Dutch East Indies and around there to assist with the Dutch patrol aircraft and the British patrol aircraft already out there, you can have far greater reconnaissance effort, but also because they can sustain and support their aircraft independently of infrastructure, because they are their infrastructure, then you have the option that the aircraft which are at Singapore, etc., are not as overused, which might stop the whole issue with the miscommunication when it was strike aircraft which weren't available, but the Navy took the idea that there's no air support available, meaning there's no air support fighters or strike aircraft, whereas for the Air Force officers involved, well, if you don't have strike aircraft, then you have no air support. Well, we still have fighters, of course. Fighter coverage is fine, but you have no air support. And you can both understand the Air Force's argument of, well, it's the offensive capability is the air support, is the strike aircraft, and they're not available because they've worn themselves out doing reconnaissance missions. Versus what the Royal Navy cared about was fighters, and that caused all the problems with 4C, etc. But again, and again, comes back to this is basically increasing the assets available for operations. This is increasing the capability of the force and increasing the size of the force earlier on. It's not necessarily mimicking what the Americans did. Please note I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that for the Royal Navy, if the funding had been made available, investing in a couple of dozen of seaplane tenders / mobile naval airbase tenders, mobile naval infrastructure tenders, would have helped sustain a huge amount of capability that could have been a force multiplier in secondary and tertiary theatres, which would enable forces to be reallocated to primary theatres. Would enable forces to be more easily spent. Less of a, right, and we only have these aircraft carriers. What do we use them for? We have all these operations too. Oh, we also have these aviation assets, and whilst they're not the same as the aircraft carriers, they can provide a 50% or a 60% solution. So we can now take these tasks, which are critical, but can be done by them, off the aircraft carrier requirements, and use the aircraft carriers for those operations instead. Sometimes force multiplication is just that simple. It's not, this asset enables all these other things to do. No, this asset can do those other jobs, which enables us to focus this on this. Last example is HMS Albatross. She is the other seaplane tender that is available to the Royal Navies in World War II. Again, she's a useful asset. She's not particularly massive. She's not particularly overwhelming in her capabilities, but she's capable of doing her job. And that's what you need her for. She supports seaplanes. And that's what the Royal Navy realistically needed. This is about providing the Navy with capability and providing Britain with more multiplication of assets. It would have been a nice thing to have. But they didn't. And as said, the answer comes back to making the case for it. As it often does in defense matters, as it often does in procurement matters. Can you make a case for it? Can you make a case for it that your audience connects with? And the audience that matters are the decision makers. Yes, the wider public matters. Yes, you need to get them on side. Yes, you want to get them engaged. But ultimately, the people whose mind you have to change are the people who are signing the checks on behalf of the taxpayer. And that's sometimes a very big ask, because they're going to be getting a lot of information shoved at them from a lot of different directions. When I was younger, I would often think, when I was reading about decisions made in history which didn't seem to make sense to me, that it must be some form of corruption. My grandfather made a good point. Corruption, we would often assume, is the corruption in terms of bribery. But there is also the scenario where you can corrupt someone's mind by making a very persuasive argument. And the other side is not so able to make such a good argument. Because you can make an argument which connects with them, which connects with their values, with their needs. I then turned around and said, but that's not corruption, that's bias, that's good argument. He smiled at that one. The point, I think, was, thinking about it afterwards, is that what can look like corruption from one person's perspective on the outside can just be that in the room the best argument was made for something which turned out to not be the case. Or rather, the argument for the thing which should be done, which makes sense to you on reading through history, was just not that persuasive in the room. This is the problem, though, we get coming up time and time again in not just defense spending, not just procurement, but in a lot of our lives. Quality of argument matters. Judging your audience matters. Some audiences enjoy listening to data. Some audiences, the insurance argument is a very strong argument. But not for everyone is that the case. The insurance argument doesn't work for everyone. For some, the world is fine now. Why should it be wrong tomorrow? Why would I have insurance? I know a few people like that. It's never made sense to me, but in the nicest way, if I make an argument to those people based on the idea of this is an insurance, they're going to go, the world's fine today, why do I need to do this? Why? And I'm not going to have a good argument for them. So what argument should I make for them? What argument do I make for those who don't appreciate the insurance argument? Well, usually I make the critical mass and jobs argument, honestly. That's usually the one I try and focus in on then at that point and hope that makes a hit. But it doesn't always work. It really doesn't. But I'd like you to think about this, because I would say such infrastructure, which you consider the mobile naval basing scenario, which was literally the Royal Navy being able to set up air bases and facilities at ports so that vessels like Unicorn could interface with them and then get back to the fleet with the full assets and be able to support and sustain the aircraft with the fleet. These vessels make sense to that. Having such vessels makes sense to that. The fact they didn't undermines it. They were reliant entirely on merchant hulls they could hire in wartime and gain access to under conflict scenarios. Entirely dependent upon that for their movement and their support. And that doesn't make sense. It really doesn't when you consider the scenario they're faced with. So today's question, I want you to think about history. I want you to think about scenarios which haven't made sense to you. And what do you think about the arguments which were made for those things, and the audience which those arguments were made to? I want you to ask yourself if really the best arguments were made for the audience. Think through history. Think about events which haven't made sense to you, and go, so what are the arguments they're making for that to be done? What arguments were made for the decision which makes sense to me? And were they really the best arguments you made to the audience that was listening? I'm interested to hear what your points are. I'm interested to hear what your examples are. What have we got coming up? Next week we have Alvaro. No, this one comes out, it'll be the Royal Navy College at Greenwich. That'll be a fun one. The Paulette Affair and the diplomatic leadership of Admiral Richard Thomas. Oh, that's going to be a fun one for the end of February. That's going to be another one which is going to probably get very few people spotting it, because it's a piece of history which often gets overlooked, but it's a really cool piece of leadership. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed.